Imagine this. A young boy with a heart full of kindness spots an elderly man struggling with his broken wheelchair. Without hesitation, he jumps in to fix it, thinking it's just a simple act of help. But what happens next? This small act of kindness leads to something no one expected, something that will leave you stunned. The elderly man's family, who's been through their own struggles, never saw this coming. Is there more to this repair than meets the eye? As the boy works on the wheelchair, a strange twist unfolds, leaving everyone in shock. What could it possibly mean for the elderly man's family? Stay tuned to find out how this unexpected moment changes everything for them, and how one small act of goodwill can stir up a life-changing mystery. Trust me, you won't believe what happens next. The elderly man, Mr. Thompson, had lived in the same neighborhood for years, always seen sitting on his porch with a quiet smile. But behind that smile, his family knew the pain he carried. Years of isolation, regret, and the haunting memories of a life once full of promise. His wheelchair, his only means of independence, had started to fall apart recently, and no one seemed to have the time or energy to fix it. That's when 12-year-old Ethan came into the picture. Ethan wasn't from a wealthy family, but he was known for his big heart and a natural knack for fixing things. When he noticed Mr. Thompson struggling, he saw it as just another opportunity to lend a hand, never imagining the impact his simple gesture would have. As Ethan worked, something strange happened. An old letter, long forgotten, slipped from the broken chair. The envelope had Mr. Thompson's name on it, but the handwriting was unfamiliar. As Ethan stared at the envelope in his hand, a sense of unease settled over him. The handwriting, though elegant, looked old, as if it had been penned decades ago. He hesitated for a moment, unsure if he should show it to Mr. Thompson, but the curiosity was too strong to ignore. He gently handed the letter to the old man, his hands trembling slightly. Mr. Thompson's face drained of color as his eyes locked onto the letter, and for the first time in a long while, his smile vanished. "Where'd you find this?" Mr. Thompson asked, his voice cracking. His hands shook as he took the envelope, his fingers tracing the edges like they were the last thread connecting him to something long lost. The silence between them felt heavy, as if the world itself had stopped. Ethan was about to ask what was wrong when the front door creaked open. It was Mrs. Thompson, the elderly man's daughter, who hadn't visited in months. The tension in the room grew thicker as she glanced at the letter in her father's hands. The look on her face shifted instantly from confusion to something darker, something unreadable. "Where'd you get that, Dad?" she asked, her voice sharp. Mr. Thompson's eyes darted between his daughter and Ethan, his breath shallow. It's from someone I thought I'd lost, a long time ago." Mrs. Thompson stepped forward, her gaze now fixed on Ethan with a strange intensity. "You shouldn't have touched that," she muttered, barely above a whisper. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine, as if he'd opened a door to a secret that was never meant to be found. The letter, this mysterious letter, seemed to be at the center of something far deeper, something buried in the past that could shatter the fragile peace that held the family together. Ethan didn't understand why the letter was so important, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a coincidence he had found it. Why had it been hidden in the chair all this time? And why was it causing such an intense reaction from Mr. Thompson's family? The room grew heavy with unspoken words, and Ethan felt like an intruder in a place he didn't belong. Just then, Mr. Thompson's voice broke the silence. "There's something you need to know." Mr. Thompson's voice faltered, and for a moment, it seemed like he might say something that would finally clear the thick fog of mystery hanging over the room. But instead, he clutched the letter tighter, his knuckles white, as if holding on to the last piece of his sanity. Mrs. Thompson stepped closer, her eyes never leaving her father. "Dad, please," he pleaded, her voice trembling now. "Don't do this. Not now." Ethan stood frozen, feeling as though he were witnessing something far more intense than he could understand. His instincts screamed that this letter was the key to everything, the key to the strange tension he felt in the air. Something about the way Mrs. Thompson reacted told him this was no ordinary family issue. Whatever was hidden inside that letter, it had the power to unravel their entire world. Mr. Thompson's eyes softened as he looked at his daughter, but the sorrow in them was unmistakable. "I never wanted you to know," he whispered, his voice barely audible. He took a deep breath, his gaze flickering to the envelope. "But I owe you the truth. After all these years, I owe you that." Just as he was about to speak, the sound of the doorbell echoed through the house, sharp and jarring. The interruption felt like a force of nature, pulling them all back from the edge of something neither of them was ready to face. Mrs. Thompson, visibly shaken, shot a glance toward the door before turning back to her father. "Don't open it," she said, the warning clear in her voice. But before anyone could react, the door swung open. Standing there was a man, a stranger, dressed in dark, formal clothing. His face was shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, and his eyes gleamed with an unsettling calm. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, his voice cold and unyielding. "But I believe that letter belongs to me." The words hung in the air, thick with a sense of inevitability. Ethan's heart raced. What had they just walked into? Who was this man, and how was he connected to everything? Mr. Thompson looked like he had seen a ghost. His hands trembled even more as he stood up from the chair, the letter still clutched in his fist. "You," Mr. Thompson began, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've come back." The man didn't respond right away, only taking a slow step forward. Ethan's gaze shifted between the two of them, sensing the storm about to break. The room, which had felt like it was filled with secrets, now felt suffocating, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something that would change everything. "Who is he, Dad?" Mrs. Thompson demanded, her voice shaking, but Mr. Thompson remained silent. The tension between them crackled, and Ethan realized the full weight of what was about to happen. Whatever the letter contained, whatever past had been buried for so long, it was about to explode into the present in a way none of them were prepared for. The stranger's gaze was unyielding, his posture rigid, as if he were waiting for permission, or a signal, from someone in the room. Mrs. Thompson stepped back, her face drained of color, her mouth agape as she struggled to process what was happening. The tension in the air became so thick it was almost suffocating. "Who are you?" Mrs. Thompson demanded, her voice a mix of fear and anger. "What do you want with that letter?" The stranger didn't flinch. He stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Mr. Thompson, who was still frozen in place, his grip tightening around the envelope. "You don't remember me, do you?" the man said coldly, his voice slow and deliberate. "But you should." The words struck like a hammer. Mrs. Thompson's face went pale, and even Ethan could feel the weight of the revelation, though he had no idea what was truly happening. Why was this man so certain Mr. Thompson knew him? "I told you I'd be back," the stranger continued, his tone now laced with a dark promise. "And now the past comes calling. You can't hide from it any longer." Before anyone could respond, the man reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out an old, weathered photograph. He tossed it onto the table in front of Mr. Thompson, and it landed with a soft thud. Ethan caught a glimpse of it. The photo was blurry but unmistakable, a much younger Mr. Thompson standing alongside the man, both of them grinning at the camera. But what made Ethan's blood run cold was the third figure in the photo, a woman, unmistakably Mrs. Thompson, though she appeared much younger, and smiling. But it wasn't just the people in the photo that shocked him. The date written on the back of the photo sent a chill through his bones, 1965, the year Mrs. Thompson was born. "What is this?" Mrs. Thompson whispered, her voice barely audible. Her eyes flickered from the photograph to her father, and then back to the stranger. Her hands began to shake. Mr. Thompson's face darkened, and Ethan could see the color drain from his cheeks. No, it can't be," he muttered, backing away slightly. The stranger didn't answer. Instead, he looked at Mrs. Thompson with a grim expression. "Your father and I made a deal long ago. A deal that now must be fulfilled." The room grew heavy with unspoken history, the air thick with a secret that neither Mr. Thompson nor his daughter seemed ready to face. The stakes had just been raised, and Ethan felt like he was in the middle of something far larger than he had ever anticipated. Whatever this man was talking about, it had the power to destroy everything: their family, their history, and maybe even their futures. Mrs. Thompson's eyes flickered with realization, her face paling even more. You're the one, aren't you?" she whispered, almost to herself. The stranger nodded slowly, his lips curling into a cruel smile. "I've been waiting for this moment a long time, and now it's time for your father to pay for what he owes." The room felt colder, and Ethan could see Mrs. Thompson's legs start to buckle, the weight of the revelation almost too much for her to bear. This wasn't just about an old letter, it was about a debt that was long overdue, and whatever it was about to consume them all. Ethan's heart raced, his mind struggling to keep up. The photograph, the mysterious stranger, and the words echoing in the room, all of it painted a picture of a secret so deep it could shatter the fragile peace of this family forever. But what exactly was the debt? And what would happen when the truth finally came to light? As the silence grew unbearable, the stranger's final words hit like a thunderclap. "I'm here to collect." The room was so quiet now that Ethan could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. The stranger's chilling words hung in the air like a storm cloud, ready to burst. "I'm here to collect." Mrs. Thompson's knees gave way, and she collapsed into the nearest chair, her hands trembling as she clutched the photo to her chest. No, this can't be happening," she whispered, almost pleading with herself more than anyone else. Mr. Thompson stood motionless, his face ashen, as though the weight of the years had finally caught up with him. "I never wanted you to know," he muttered, his voice breaking. "It was a mistake, a terrible mistake. I thought I had time to make things right." Ethan's mind raced. What debt? What mistake? And why was this stranger threatening them now? The man stepped closer, his cold eyes never leaving Mr. Thompson. "Time's up. You should have come clean long ago, but now the price is higher than you could have ever imagined." Mrs. Thompson, her voice barely above a whisper, finally spoke up. It's about my mother, isn't it?" Her eyes were wide with recognition, as if the pieces of the puzzle were finally starting to fall into place. "This has been about her all along." The stranger didn't speak at first, but the flicker of acknowledgement in his eyes was enough. Mrs. Thompson's breath hitched. "You were involved in her disappearance, weren't you? You and Dad, you both knew what happened to her, but you never told me." Mr. Thompson closed his eyes, as though ashamed of the truth that had finally come to light. "I didn't want you to carry that burden. It was a tragic accident, but he was there, and he's been haunting me ever since." The stranger smirked darkly. "It wasn't an accident, old man, and I'm not here for your apologies." He turned to Mrs. Thompson, his tone colder than before. "Your mother, she knew things she shouldn't have. Things about this man's past, things he tried to bury." The weight of his words hit like a ton of bricks. Ethan's mind reeled, struggling to piece it all together. Mrs. Thompson's mother had known something dark, something so dangerous it had cost her her life, and Mr. Thompson had been involved in it all. "But why now?" Mrs. Thompson demanded, standing up and glaring at the stranger. "What do you want from us? What is it that you're trying to force him to do?" The stranger's gaze flickered between father and daughter. "It's not about what I want. It's about what your father owes. I came to collect the truth. He lied to you for years, hiding the dark past, and now it's time for you to face it." Just as Mrs. Thompson opened her mouth to speak, the unexpected happened. The sound of a loud crash echoed from the back of the house, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Another figure appeared at the door, silhouetted in the dim light. Ethan turned, his heart skipping a beat. It was a woman, older, with strikingly familiar features. As she stepped forward into the room, Mrs. Thompson gasped. "Mom. But how?" The woman smiled softly, though there was no warmth in it. "I'm sorry it took me so long to come back," she said, her voice a mixture of sadness and resolve. "But you needed to know the truth, and I couldn't let him drag you into this any longer." The stranger's eyes widened, and his face contorted in a mixture of fury and disbelief. "No, no, it can't be. You." But the woman raised a hand, silencing him. "You've been playing this game for far too long," she said, her gaze turning to Mr. Thompson, whose eyes were now filled with a deep, unmistakable guilt. "It's over now. The debt is paid, and there's no hiding from it anymore."